Yesterday was the final cut day for NFL teams, and after the final cuts were made, I read a fairly perceptive article on developing talent, and especially developing talent in young players in the NFL, and the use of the practice squad and some of the kind of NFL specific details. But one of the main points that the article made was that players are never the same. From moment to moment, game to game, year to year, players are changing, both positively and negatively. In the NFL, it was talking about the difference between an older player and a younger player, with an older player, likely more beat up and more likely to get injured, versus a younger player who's, healthier, but also doesn't have the same experience that an older player has, and that the older player has accrued during their time in the NFL. And so every player is different, and you can't make a single judgment about a player, because that might change. One great game or one great play may give the player confidence to make them perform at a higher level going forward. One bad game may set a player back, especially if that player doesn't know how to handle mistakes. And so one failure of coaching and talent ID and selecting teams and so forth is making rigid judgments. So I remember years ago when I used to be really involved on internet message boards for basketball coaches, coaches would brag that they could identify 7th and 8th graders that would make the varsity team. And they would basically pick their varsity team when players were in middle school. And to me, it just showed a self-fulfilling prophecy. They decided that this player was going to be good, and so they kept this player moving along and probably gave that player a little bit more feedback and more opportunities, and so that player did make the varsity. And the player that they decided wasn't good in 7th or 8th grade, they didn't give those same opportunities. And so when we make rigid judgments about players, we often ignore future performances. So if we decide, that this player is good, we may ignore mistakes and continue to believe that this player is good. And continue to give this player more and more and more opportunities because of this perception that we've built in our minds. And if we decide that a player is bad, well, as soon as we see a mistake, then that just confirms the player is bad, and now that player is not going to get any more opportunities. They're going to be put on the bench. Maybe they get to play in garbage time, but that's it. They're basically done with that coach. And this, again, is one of the reasons why I don't have as much problems with players transferring as some people, because I do think that coaches can make these judgments, and they can make fairly rigid judgments about players at one point in time, and they're fairly unchanging regardless of what happens to either support or detract from that judgment. The coach tends to keep a fairly rigid assessment of a player, and so when that happens to a player, fairly or unfairly, sometimes moving to a different coach is the best recourse for that player and for that coach, in that situation. I've seen situations where, I worked with a player who was coming back from an ACL surgery. And so she came back, and in October, she was, 6 months out from surgery, 5 months out from surgery, wasn't even full with her rehab. And was starting to get on the court, was looking slow, a little bit uncoordinated on the court. But this was the first time that the coach had seen that player play. And so the coach made this judgment that this player wasn't good enough, was too slow and all these things, ignoring the fact that she was, only 5 months out from ACL surgery. And so then 4 months later, when she had, done more rehab and we'd gotten her back close to where she was before she was injured, and she was, in my estimation, a completely different player than she had been in October, because now she had confidence in her knee, she was able to cut, change directions, and now she was able to utilize her full skill set, passing, dribbling, shooting, and was a completely different player. But that coach still had this rigid viewpoint that she was this slow, uncoordinated player that couldn't really defend well enough, and consequently she didn't get the same opportunities to play in games that she probably deserved compared to the other players on the team. So again, this can be a real danger when we're trying to develop players. If we decide early on what a player is or what a player can be, that can be limiting to that player, and not allow that player, the full opportunity to develop. And it can also be, a mistake in terms of talent identification or team selection. If we make these early judgments on players and we're not flexible moving forward, we're not allowing ourselves to take in new information and potentially change our viewpoint based on, further information, what we see, potential developments from that player. As long as we talk about, the importance of skill development and player development and talent development and how we can facilitate this in our players, part of that is within our own judgments and making sure that we're not making rigid judgments of players, but that we're flexible and we're allowing what a player does moving forward to change our perception of that player if necessary, so that we can acknowledge their development and improvement and not maintain this rigid judgment from one point in time that may or may not be accurate in the future.